Hello and welcome to the Terra Firma Cowl knit along. So today we'll be talking about choosing and substituting yarn, swatching, evaluating your swatch, and based on your swatch, estimating the finished size and the amount of yarn you'll use for your cowl. This particular video is all about choosing and substituting yarn. When you're considering yarn options for your cowl, there are a few things you might like to keep in mind. The first step is the weight of the yarn. The weight of a yarn refers to how thick or thin a yarn is, and is typically given a name like fingering or lace or DK or worsted. The Terra Firma Cowl pattern was written for sport weight or 5-ply yarn, and the gauge listed in the pattern is to achieve a nice fabric with sport weight yarn. Does that mean you can't use a different weight of yarn like fingering or DK? No, not at all. There is a calculator that I included with this pattern that can help you figure out how much yarn you'll use and the finished dimensions of your cowl based on your swatch. So that means you can use any weight of yarn and you'll be able to figure out how big it's going to be or how much yarn you'll use for your specific weight of yarn. That being said, you will want to keep in mind that if you're using a smaller yarn like fingering or lace weight, you're going to want to go down a few needle sizes in order to get a nice fabric. If you use a bigger needle with a smaller yarn, you're going to get a fabric that's kind of like this, where you can kind of poke your fingers through it, which if you're trying to keep warm is not the best. That being said, if you want to use a smaller weight yarn and you do go down a few needle sizes, your cowl is obviously going to be smaller than the pattern lists. If you want to add some extra width, you can do that by adding some more seed stitch lace repeats, and instructions for that are included in the make it your own portion of the pattern. If you want to use a larger yarn like a DK, a worsted, or a bulky, you're going to want to go up a few needle sizes to get a nice fabric. You'll get a wider and a longer cowl. If you don't go up needle sizes, you're going to get a very dense fabric, which is not going to fold super well around your neck. Next up, I want to talk about fiber considerations. I am not a yarn snob. I chose wool for this because I like how it feels, how it washes, and how it holds up long term. You can absolutely get a result you love with other fibers, so here are a few tips. If you're planning on working with an alpaca yarn, alpaca does not have as much memory as wool, and so it will grow a lot in circumference or row-wise with wear. You may also notice the leaves don't quite pop out quite as nicely. It's a little bit flatter than the wool yarn. You may want to work fewer row repeats or with a smaller needle size so you don't end up with a cowl that stretches to the moon and back. If you plan on working with a synthetic fiber like acrylic linen or cotton, you will likely want to knit at a larger gauge or a larger needle than the pattern because the yarn does not stretch quite like wool. It also does not stretch out quite as much when it is washed. So using a larger gauge helps the fabric drape better when it's wound around a neck. The next thing to consider is the yarn structure. When I'm talking about structure, I'm talking about how the yarn is physically put together. So in this case, with Malabrigo Arroyo, you can see that it is plied. And it's fairly loosely plied, like the twist isn't super tight. It's also fairly stretchy, so I can take a length of it and I can stretch it a little bit. If you're using a different structure of yarn, like a super tightly plied yarn, like this Paragon from Knit Picks, you can see that the ply structure is super defined. And that does affect the final look of the piece. So if you look at the stockinette section, you can see how the plies are actually showing in that, and it can be a little bit distracting. You can see the seed stitch section too, the texture isn't shown off quite as nicely. If you're planning on working with a single ply yarn, pay attention to how the stitches are stacking on top of each other in your swatch. Single ply yarn tends to have one half of the stitch legs line up vertically, and then the other half on an angle. This can make the seed stitch and other textures look unique. If you like that in your swatch, awesome. At least you know how it's going to look in the final piece. Last up, I wanted to talk about color. I typically choose a solid or a semi-solid color for texture and lace because I want the stitch patterns to be the star of the show. The yarn is kind of secondary and is there to accentuate the pattern and help display the stitch pattern. When you're putting as much work into something like this, typically you want the stitch pattern to be really evident in the final piece. If you want to use other colors, here are some considerations for other types of colorways for this cowl. One thing to keep in mind is that this cowl is worked back and forth, and there is no shaping in it. So if you're using a short run variegated or multicolor, your colors are probably going to pool, and they're probably either going to stack up on top of each other, giving you vertical stripes, or a diagonal, or sometimes like grouping or color banding. This can also happen if you're using a kettle dye, and so if you're using something that has a lot of color changes in it, you may want to consider alternating skeins for this project. I did do that with a Malabrigo Arroyo that is used in the sample, and I thought it helped break up the color a lot, especially if you have skeins that are very different coloring. If you are using a self-striping yarn, how that's going to end up looking in this piece is you're going to have bands of stripes that go horizontally. If you want your colors to line up properly at the graft line, it's going to take some pre-planning, and it may not line up exactly the way you want it to. And the same thing goes for gradient yarn. So if you're using a gradient yarn, the gradient is going to run the circumference of the cowl, and so you may want to pre-plan how that's going to be working. I think your best bet for this one would actually be to buy two skeins that are very similar and maybe run them opposite directions so that you can end up at the same gradient point when you graft the cowl together at the end. Long story short, when you're choosing or substituting a yarn, the most important thing is to just get a yarn that you love and that you think works well with the pattern. My opinion doesn't matter. It absolutely doesn't. This is something that you're making to wear yourself or to give away. So the only thing that matters is that it looks great to you. Nobody else's opinion matters. All right, I hope you enjoy stash diving, and I'll catch you in the next video where we'll talk about swatching.